Awuni, and I'll be your chair for this round. I will give my panelists a chance to kind of introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there onwards.
Hello, my name is Farhan. I'll be the panel of this round. My preferred gender pronouns are they or them. Best of luck to all teams for this round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farhan. Just a few housekeeping rules. Before you start your speech, kindly state your name. Obviously, your position will be obvious, and thereafter, please state how you'd like to receive your POI, so either in the chat space or by verbal interruption. In the event that a speaker does not indicate how they would like to receive their POIs, kindly revert to the usual, which is via chat space. With that being said, we call upon the Prime Minister to start the speech. Thank you very
much. Okay.
Please excuse before Prime Minister starts. Just excuse. Sorry, I'm sorry. Please, my partner is not here, so I might have to iron. I don't know if that's good, but with the panel.
That's absolutely fine.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, just to confirm again, you guys can hear me, right?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so I am Ayafa. I go by he, him pronouns. I'll take POIs in the chat if that's cool with everyone. Could someone please put time in the chat too? Because my timer is definitely not working here.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with like a little bit of clarity on this demographic, just so that we can understand how the rest of today's debate goes, and we will try to avoid running like very, very cliche taglines in today's debate. So first off, we think it's crucial to note that the demographic under discussion in today's debate is like really, really small, like 1,000th of the population. Most of us in this round had not heard of this demographic before the round started, so we don't have a lot of mainstream access in the very first place, right? What this means is two things. One is that because they are not mainstream and because they believe in these ideologies, they probably don't get along well with the rest of society. Then it's safe to assume at this point that they are probably also really tight-knit, because if you have an ideology that, then you're probably going to aggregate into small spaces and small ecosystems to relate. The outline of this, or the outcome of this, is twofold. One is that you probably end up in a system or in a society where you're hanging around like a small group of people, and you build your entire life and belief system around this small group of people. This leads to two outcomes in general, right? These two outcomes look like this, yeah? Is that one, you probably cannot live or exist without this group because you've pulled so much society or pulled so much of your life around this group, much the same way a religion functions. And then by virtue of that, it's safe to assume that because you can't live without these groups, or you can't probably socialize properly without these groups, that you probably aren't incentivized to leave them. What that means is simple, is that even if you go into social media, you're probably not going to be convinced to leave, even if you have doubts or thoughts, because the entirety of your society is built around these systems. We think that clarification and clarity is very crucial in today's debates before we start anything. What that means is that there's only one way this thing can go, like when they go into social media, they recruit more people. Why is this likely, and why is it that even when it doesn't happen, it's still very bad? Because one, we think it's fairly likely because fascism is still an ideology that exists in society today. But the reason why it doesn't have pull is that its original source of logic was eugenics, which was that white people are somehow innately superior. But now that science has grown and developed, it's proven that it's wrong. But when you then make eugenics a matter of saving the world and protecting society, you are then able to create that buy-in and like people's love for those ideologies that otherwise would not have existed previously, right? So when you go into those spaces and you then get exposed to fascists and you then give them that legitimacy in this instance, it on net becomes a problematic thing because they then have further drive and further pull and a new form of legitimacy. Okay, let's go.
All right, so what kind of social media companies are you talking about? Are you talking about Facebook, Twitter? Just characterize them, please.
We feel like this debate just applies to all social media, like keep them out of everything, like if need be. Probably leave them maybe WhatsApp, Discord, maybe, because those ones don't really count as social media, but anything that allows you to access people that you don't normally relate with, you should kick them out of. That's very simple, yeah? So I think that for clarity on this case, we then have to look at one key thing, right? Is that there's a specter of socially acceptable norms in ideologies, right? What that means is that what we relate with and what we accept exists within a space. The demographic of that space is that the ideologies you preach are not fundamentally harmful to other people. So if you preach about massive slaughters and cannibalism, society already says those kind of things. So to the extent where this ideology explains and builds around the idea that some other people are fundamentally inferior to others, we think that alone is legitimacy enough to ban them because they access and question the dignity and human relevance of other members of society and claim that by virtue of the lack of that human relevance, that they automatically deserve to be killed for the saving of humanity. We think that itself is fundamentally bad. But we think, second of all, that society should obstruct and restrict any movement that seeks to destroy society. And I think that is very simple on the premise of self-defense and on the premise of like just generally like how society functions in the status quo. Is why we kill terrorists and why we kill criminals in the status quo, because we believe that criminality in itself is problematic. So to the extent it threatens society, and to the extent where it threatens society, it becomes legitimate to strip the rights of those states, right? So in this instance, we think a good legitimacy, and the reason why we should do this is that it strips the rights of members of society and it's harmful to members of society and society at large. How is it harmful? Because one, if their ideology comes into fruition, it's safe to assume that half of people already existing in society will die. What that means is that fundamentally, this is already a problematic thing because it supports mass slaughter. The second reason why it's fundamentally problematic is that if so many people die, economic systems and pretty much everything that functions and allows society to function will go haywire. The impact of this is just generally bad because this means that like there's going to be a ton of suffering, even for the people that are left alive in that status quo, which is fundamentally bad. We then think by extension that to the extent where this sufficiently proves that the belief in this ideology, especially when it grows and possibly comes into fruition, is problematic, then we automatically think that it's something that should be suppressed and should probably be campaigned against and prevented from spreading into society because of the extreme potential it has to harm society in this instance, right? By extension, this means that we're very okay with it continuously being suppressed and being like held down consistently. But we also think it moves into the idea of self-defense. Self-defense primarily from like the point of view of society, but also from social media companies, right? We think society is allowed to defend itself from external aggressors, which is why societies are legitimate in going to war. They are legitimate in possibly even imprisoning people and stripping people's rights, because society is legitimate to like protect itself. And to the extent where we've shown how this ideology is harmful to society, then we think it's a legitimate action to perceive on their end to carry out actions that protect themselves, right? So we think that the reason why you should do this is because if you don't do it, it's harmful to society, and then you should protect yourselves. But moving on beyond that, onto the idea of social media. Social media thrives primarily because of a large amount of access, right? So in a world where you decide to kill a massive amount of people to reduce population, to protect economies and protect society and the ecology itself, we think that that in turn means that social media becomes less functional because there's a mass slaughter of tons of people that should probably not die within that instance, right? So we think that if that's where the mechanism comes in, social media companies can do this, and legitimate to do this, and should do this because it's an act of self-defense against the harms and mechanism systems that currently work against them to make their lives a whole lot more miserable, right? So we think that alone serves as legitimacy enough. What that means in summary is simple, right? Is that we show you how this is harmful, and as such, like society needs to protect itself, and social media companies, as a member of society, have to protect themselves and have an obligation to society to protect society. But more importantly, we show you how even in a world where you access them to social media, they're probably not going to change. So it's better to just simply lock them up in their echo chambers and let them do whatever they want to do within those systems, because that itself is a lot more sustainable because they are small enough to not do anything now. I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and for setting the fundamentals of this debate. And now we call upon the Leader of Opposition to provide a clash basis for the argument. Hear, hear.
Hi guys, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, I have no timer with me, so I'm just going to be hoping that Chair is able to like do that for me on the text, please. Also take pure eyes in the text space. My eyes are literally glued on the text space. All right. I'm just going to do this before I start. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Madam Chair, if this debate was about the merit or demerit of eco-fascism and whether it was something that was good or bad inherently, then we are happy to allow opening government to win. But however, this debate is primarily centered around whether social media platforms should censor materials that promote eco-fascism. This is entirely different because you cannot say that social media has an obligation to censor every material that has harms, right? Because within the social media generally is a liberalized space. I'm going to respond to the basic crux of what they tell you. They say, oh, eco-fascism is bad. Eco-fascism suggests that half of the world population is going to die for all of these things to happen. But then that even when we agree with them on this does not provide a particular justified reason for you to make social media platforms censor it. We're going to give you 2 reasons why. Firstly, on the principles, understand that social media exists around the concept of allowing people to have the ability to contribute in equal measure, right? The concept of free speech and all of that. But more importantly, it is about how all ideologies are valid, right? Understand this. It means that we cannot say that we censor all materials on communism or socialism simply because we're a capitalist state, or we must not censor, or we must censor all materials on nihilism. Regardless of the fact that these ideologies are ideologies that do not have, very large applications within our societies, that censorship is unimportant and should not be done for 2 key reasons. Firstly, because we think that there is no absolute ideology. There is no ideology that you can refer to as the absolute truth. The reason society is able to move forward is because of a nuanced and balanced interrogation of 2 perspectives. What a very opposite and contrasting ideology does for you, more importantly, within a space as open as social media, is that it allows the opportunity for intellectual discourse. When you censor this, you do 2 things. Firstly, you create a very wrong narrative that suggests that whatever the opposite ideology is 100% valid. You do this in 2 ways. Firstly, because you have eliminated the possibility of people coming up with contrasting perspectives that is going to lead to very valid intellectual discourse. You have only given people who are members of the consumer public, only one thing to consume. But more importantly, within that a statement like this inherently invalidates everything the entirety of an ideology preaches. This is bad because even when ideologies have very huge, moral flaws, just like eco-fascism does, but then there are still particular facets of it that could be imbibed to create some sort of balance, with regards to the evaluation of what ideologies you should, take with regards to environmental pollution and those kind of things. But then, even in the worst case scenario where Ayafa tells you, oh, it is it is bad and it needs to be suppressed and those kinds of things, we think that it's still better that you do not censor it on social media for 2 key reasons. What happens when you censor it on social media is that you allow these people to organically grow ecosystems that you cannot control or you cannot legislate upon. It means that I am going to be speaking, I'm going to groom my children to believe in eco-fascism. They're going to groom their friends in school and those kinds of things. Why this is bad is that even though intellectual discourse and contrasting opinions can exist at those points in time, it is significantly smaller. But with social media, we have a very large group of people who can contribute and provide contrasting opinions that can benefit us in 2 ways. Firstly, because there is a potential that through this intellectual discourse, these people who are the pioneers and proselytizers of this eco-fascism are going to reach some sort of middle ground and possibly agree with all of the engagement that is going to come, because social people are significantly disincentivized from the indoctrination of eco-fascism, because they see that things like cancel culture and how the general public is always going to be against people who have these very radical and immoral opinions. It means that people are continually scared away from imbibing or indoctrinating themselves to these ideologies. It means that in their world where they tell you that, oh, Like, we think that this thing needs to be suppressed. Our world suppresses is poor, right? Because even when you stop them from like coming on social media to do these kinds of things, in their day-to-day interactions, they're going to speak to one person, they're going to speak to two people. Why that is bad is because it is not a large enough group to be able to put the kind of pressure to be heard.
Apologies, speaker. You seem to be breaking up considerably.
Can I still be heard?
I can hear you, but you're breaking up. Would you mind just like reconnecting?
How is it now?
Okay, that's way worse.
On the clash on whether are we better able to suppress this ideology? So think that in opening government world, you allow these people to continually grow their echo chambers without any sort of contrasting opinion, because in their world, we pretend that these opinions do not exist. In our world, we allow these materials and these opinions to come up. If we think that they are bad, we have a very large mob of people who have the moral compass to be able to engage and interrogate the legitimacy of these ideologies in and of themselves. Why is this true? We think that because of the nature of social media and now how it is something that is predominantly liberal, right? It means that pop culture and those kinds of things are more predominant within these places, things around like LGBTQ+, and more importantly, like how everyone is like literally pro-life. It means that there is a very large group of people who have the ability and the moral compass to be able to engage eco-fascism within social media and be able to firstly, create some sort of cancel culture that dissuades people from looking into this ideology if we think it is bad, but more importantly, we think that it is good because we think that contrasting opinions create some sort of balance, right? We think that whether or not we buy into the concept of eco-fascism or not, we think that it is still an important check mechanism that exists to ensure that the ideologies you buy into are things that are kept in check in one way or the other. It means that we know that if the ideologies we buy into are failing, right? We think that we know that there are people who are eco-fascists who are going to be like, oh, I told you so, I told you that this is the way, and those kinds of things. In our world, this sort of balance checking mechanism ensures that there are always nuanced discussions around whether or not these ideologies are important in and of themselves. Speaker, this debate is not about whether eco-fascism is something that has merit or demerit. We do not think that we have the ability to be able to determine that. But what we can determine is that it is a school of thought. It is just like how within social media, people who think that pedophilia should be legalized have their say on social media, bring their contributions. It does not mean that this leads to an increasing prevalence of the support for pedophilia. It means that people are able to engage in this discourse and say, oh, we do not think that this is something that is right. This is something that runs along those lines. At the end of the day, the reason we win is that we prove to you firstly how it is wrong in principle to stifle people's opinions and school of thought. But secondly, even if we wanted to suppress the concept of eco-fascism, we thought that world does it better because we create a very large community of people who are going to be able to more importantly engage this and make the world inherently a better place. Proud.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to close this debate for the opening government. Hear, hear.
All right, am I audible?
Yo, ping pong, I better check the chat.
Yeah, I've seen it. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you very much. So for POIs, unmute yourself and ask, but that doesn't mean you should badger. I think it's maybe when you're listening to my speech, you could easily tell when to ask POI or when is the most appropriate time to ask POI. And if you ask once and I don't take you, don't have to unmute within the next maybe few minutes, because I probably wouldn't take you if I wasn't going to take you then. Preferably maybe around the third minute downwards, and preferably CO if you have anything. Yes, obviously, I'm also timing myself. Can you hear this bell? I'm timing myself so you can hear the timer from here too. All right. So I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. What OP fails to realize is that people who are deeply entrenched in ecofascism as an ideology already proselytize in person, which means they already create echo chambers even when they have access to social media platforms. So banning them or censoring them from social media platforms is not automatically going to create that as an option. They already do that in start school. What you do in our world is that you eliminate one of the platforms they have to proselytize their ideologies in the first instance. So they are cooperative of how you're going to create deeply entrenched echo chambers, probably always exist in status quo. And we see that as fundamental harm. But then they try to run this line that they don't have any issues with the idea that Eco-Fascism is harmful, but the idea that they need it to be interrogated. And this is now the biggest clash in this debate. Where do you get better interrogation in our society? One, there is no presumption that interrogation needs to happen where there is conversations. The reason is because there are certain ideologies that do not fall within the scope of acceptable ideologies, which one, when you allow them to exist, create intense polarization, but two, extreme oppression and violence upon persons' idea, dignity, and identity, such that it is legitimate to entirely ban them rather than having conversations, similar to reasons why we don't have conversations against Nazism or whether or not slavery is a justified cause, because those things no longer fall in within the scope of acceptance of ideologies. What is this argument and how does this weigh against opposition? Note that society has evolved to a point where communication and understanding is one of the biggest fostering tools. But there are certain ideologies that go to the extreme end of very extreme ideologies that it is extremely harmful to include society. Why? There is a scope created that ideologies have to meet a certain criteria for them to be a valid ideologies. What are those criteria? One, it has to make an overlapping consensus to coexist with other ideologies, even though it is different. This is the reason why we can have conservative and liberal politicians within the same scope. Secondly, it has to concede not to assault human dignity or other people's agency and autonomy. That is the basic requirement that ideologies need to make to be considered valid. When ideologies fail this criteria, they are obscene, and the most relevant thing is to purge them from society, because including them brings about chaos, fosters less public discourse, and encourages violent acts against persons in the vast majority of instances. Reasons why hate speech is banned, reasons why we don't want to hear opinion on genocide or whether or not euthanasia is good or bad. The reason is because there is no fundamental utility derived from engaging in such conversations, because you can never reach middle ground. Why? One, these ideologies are extremely radicalized, right? Two, watering them down is them losing the fundamental approaches because they are extremely radical. That means moderate ideologies would almost prevail in most instances. The fact that they are not willing to reach a middle ground and reach a common consensus means there will be loggerheads who will continuously exist on their store-found ideologies. But the problem is that their mere existence constitutes fundamental harm, because Ayafa tells you that there is likelihood of them proselytizing and recruiting individuals who can be extremely radical. We've seen this in history where eco-fascists and eco-terrorists go to bomb factories and do a lot of terrible things. This exists regardless of whatever noble intention they have, shows that the violent harms that they perpetuate to society is very, very harmful. But secondly, the fact that they can exist in relations of power, which means the fact that they can be able to capture power through the instrument of social media and communicative discourse by capturing people's minds and entering position of power, is a near existential threat while we ban these ideologies. The fact that Nazis were able to win 2% seats in parliament in Ukraine is the fundamental reason why possibly President Vladimir Putin wants to invade Ukraine in his claim of denazifying Ukraine. This shows you how there's an existential harm that could exist when these ideologies are excluded in public discourse. Why is it then legitimate to ban them from social media? Collins asked the POI of where exactly are you doing this? We think wherever they surface, wherever we have power to do this, right, we are going to do this. We don't need to characterize whether it's going to be Twitter. We think that you can ban them. Two, they would say, oh, you're going to go to dark web and other alternative source. There are three comparatives to this. One, you significantly reduce their population and the amount of influence they have on other individuals because they are blocked out from mainstream media. Two, when people don't know you exist or care about you, they cannot empathize. As such, your ideology has no impact on them. Three, the individuals who are believing in this or stuck in those echo chambers cannot permeate mainstream society, therefore cannot do any real impact or do any real harm at any point in time, which means you are completely exclusion from communication society, completely shut your ideology into a paper trail of very harmful and toxic ideologies, which does not have any real impact. We prefer the outcome rather than an award. Why is it that we don't want this communication or discourse to happen entirely? I'll take a POI now, if there's any, before I impact this. Any POI? There's no POI. Let me move on.
Okay, take me. Yeah. Take me, please. Take me.
Go ahead now. Go ahead.
So what do you have to say? What do you have to say about social media companies determining who gets to utilize violence or not?
That's the thing. Social media companies reflect the overriding acceptable ideologies in general society, which is the reason why if you post something that is very violent or sexist, you'll be banned or censored. Social media companies never fall far off from what general society accepts because one, That is the selling point of their market capital. 2, that is very good because they have to maintain a platform that allows for people to engage in healthy discourse. 3, because it usually makes sense to prescribe to the overturn window and the current political underpinnings of whatever society existing. The impact of this means social media companies only exist and express a power that society grasps on it, and it can never be excessive. So if your comparative word is that we should not give social media capital, social media companies, the power to determine what people discuss, that is ridiculous because they already censor in status quo and it's considered legitimate, and considered it comparative. But the second impact that flips this is that this debate is very specific about eco-fascism. We are not talking about all forms of ideologies. It is very, very specific about eco-fascism and why social media platforms should censor all materials that promote eco-fascism. This is where Ayafa's speech wins this debate with massive levels of relevance. 1, there is no presumption that free speech is an overriding good all the time. There are instances where we can legitimately ban things that constitute speech. And one of those instances when it can be offensive and oppressive. But secondly, when its existence in society constitutes an overriding harm that we cannot grant it that requirement. But 3, when it fails to meet the basic requirements and entry level of what valid ideologies constitute. 1, a valid ideology is not just something that proposes ideas. We think that anything that proposes massive reduction of human population, which Ayafa have showed you cannot do without things like massive levels of genocide or some extremely radical political or biological actions, right, shows you that humanity would never reach a consensus to adopt this sort of ideologies because it's the extreme level, right? The comparative means even in a world where eco-fascism is successful, to successfully end the problems we face with climate change, that word is a despotia because it's never going to see a fundamentally functional place for people in society. But secondly, the idea that these ideologies are exclusive to create things like racial purity are things that humanity fundamentally consider as indignifying and very oppressive in itself. The comparative then becomes there is no middle ground or utility to be found in eco-fascism. Its existence constitutes a fundamental aspect of human dignity, and we are legitimate to exclude it from public conversations. We probably win this debate.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now we call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close this debate with the opening half. Hear, hear.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Hold on, let me set my time. All right, so I'll take my POIs. I won't be paying attention to the text space. So just unmute yourself and then ask, right? But don't do that till like my 4th minute thereabout. I think OG had enough time to engage us, so I'm most likely take closing governments. Yeah, please. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, one thing you need to understand, one thing you need to pay attention to is the fact that opening government doesn't necessarily describe what censorship is. They don't necessarily characterize the social media companies. I'll do that in my speech, and I'll talk about that necessary. They also base their entire case on like how bad eco-fascism is, right? They don't engage truly on how social medias will actually censor people's ideologies and all that. Let's concede, and that's what is going to be important in my speech and why we win. Let's concede to their best case scenario that they are right. Eco-fascism truly is terrible to minorities, arguing that they should be killed off to like save the planet. That's very horrible. Let's agree to that. Why do we still win? First thing you need to understand, especially in characterization of these kind of social media companies like Twitter, for instance, is that they are largely liberal right now, which means if you come out to tweet that I think all Black people should be killed, you're probably never going to get any like or retweet. All you get is ratios of people telling you how crazy or how silly that idea is. In a world, we would rather have where people are the checking mechanisms for harmful ideas, like Ray tries to explain to you. Because on their other side of the house, where they say, oh, echo chambers will exist, these people would not have any form of checking mechanism to tell them that they are wrong. I'm going to explain the importance later in my speech. But before that, let me give some responses. They tell you that anything that harms people shouldn't exist in social media. First of all, and this is response to like my POI about violence, Facebook allows Ukrainians to tweet harm against Russian soldiers. They allow Ukrainians to tweet that Russian soldiers should be killed. They allow those kind of things to exist. What happens here when you give social media companies the ability to determine who is right and to determine what harm or violence is that it isn't necessarily certain in different contexts. Like the context could always change, which means if there's like a war on Ukraine or war on Russia, Ukrainians are allowed to tweet violence against Russian soldiers, which is like literally harm and all the assault on human dignity that Ayafa tells you, like, because these people are also like human beings as well. But if you're tweeting that they should be harmed, if you're tweeting that their families should probably be attacked as well, we think that that harm is something that when social media companies allow, is something that is very terrible. They have to defend that on like closing government probably. But then secondly, we also think that when society or like when like social like the social media spaces, because this debate is not entirely about society, are able to interrogate these things, we're able to quell those hands because they concede that this is not about other ideologies, it's about eco-fascism. One thing you need to understand and they concede to is that it's a minority kind of idea. It means there aren't many in society. But secondly, even within the right wing, they aren't even as powerful, which means that they wouldn't necessarily be as potent to carry out the kind of harms that they say that they would, right? They would be as potent to wipe it off like entire minorities. They want to save the planet, which means it's very, very unfeasible for this kind of thing to happen. Like oftentimes, like right wingers don't necessarily come out to even support these things. Like it's very, very little in that side of the house. But it also tells that out of self-defense social media companies, firstly, this is silly because oftentimes social media companies get called out. Oftentimes when censorship because censorship be beyond those materials, could even be to things like maybe certain way you interpret jokes or certain way you interpret comments that were misinterpreted. Often social media companies get called out, they get called to like Senate to testify on how they're censoring and all these things which harms them, like if they're taken to court, like they harm on those people themselves. I don't think that these guys were able to preempt that effectively. But let's fall to like our positive and our counterfactual, basically, right? I've already explained to you how Facebook like allowed Ukrainians to tweet against like Russian soldiers and their families, and why that was wrong, even if like whatever it is they want to say, they have to defend that kind of thing. But secondly, about eco-fascism primarily, even if we are to consider it's horrible, one thing you need to understand about these platforms, and I tell you that they are largely liberal, is the fact that these ideas, if they're put in those kind of platforms, wouldn't be as weighty because of the fact that it is largely liberal, like I said, meaning, first of all, that people would most likely call these things out. We think this is a better checking mechanism because of the fact that you're going to have people, let's say people who are neutral, people who never heard of this before, more likely to question this. We have like Reddit, people who are going to be like experts on these things, who bring out counter materials, because it's about the materials. Because it's not like just sharing something random, probably sharing a link or a video. We probably have people with other videos and other materials to counter that. Like on Twitter currently, every single link that you click on, they ask you who is that closing. I'll take you later. They ask you on every single link, are you sure you've read this article before you retweet or before you share? Kind of making you want to read that. That isn't censorship because that happens to literally every single article, right? We think this is a better way for like social media companies because then people can then present like other articles to inform more people like in the public. But secondly, oftentimes the importance of like calling people out and canceling people is the fact that people can even self-reflect. Before that, I'll take you. Hurry up. Okay, I'm not taking you anymore. So what happens most times, I'm not taking you anymore. What happens most times is the fact that people can self-reflect. There are so many people who have tweeted the most outrageous things. There are so many people who have tweeted the most silly things, right? And they never knew. On God's word, oftentimes these people would like go on with the belief that they are right? That they are being attacked. What happens on our world is that most people who are made to believe these things without being interrogated, without escaping the echo chamber, can then be interrogated. Oftentimes people can self-reflect that, oh crap, maybe this is probably right. Maybe this particular person is actually right. And maybe I'm the one who is wrong. There's so many people who have tweeted things and came out to apologize because of the fact that maybe they were brought up that way. They never saw other counter opinions. What happens on our world and why this is important is that we're even more likely on our side to possibly change these people. Even if we're not idealistic to say we're going to all of them, we're more likely to change those particular few people who didn't have opposing ideologies or opposing beliefs to begin with. But secondly, we also don't even think that the harm they argue is something that's going to be that terrible. Because oftentimes when you know that you can be cancelled out in these spaces, most people are more likely to water down the radicality of like the materials, which means you're not going to come out and just be so radical. You just come out to present it in like in a soft manner, like this is our worst case scenario, right? Why is this important? Because you're then able to have like a balanced, sane engagement to those materials and the relevancy. We see people hosting Twitter spaces all the time for certain things like this that could actually happen, right? Why we don't agree that this could with DPM that Discord doesn't change anything is that it actually does, especially when you see that these people before they never had any counter opinions, but now they do, which means they've exposed themselves to these prevailing like ideologies. But another thing you need to understand about social media is that it is prioritized, or it is used mostly by young people. Why is this important? Because young people oftentimes are more inquisitive. They're inquisitive. They don't just believe anything they are told, right? Which means they would always most likely weigh out like opinions. They most likely say, oh, is this the right thing to do? Is this not the right thing to do? We think that this drive of social media today, this drive of like young people and people who are inquisitive, people who want to find out, are more likely to want to interrogate these kind of ideas, or more likely to want to even call out things that are objectively harmful, even if they are. We think on our side of the house, what we do is that we ensure that these people have like counter opinions that check them, and our side is better because we don't even think the harm is as terrible as they see on these social media spaces. Proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech and for closing this debate with the opening half. We now call upon the member of government to open this debate with the closing half. Hear, hear.
Okay, Pani, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, just give me a few seconds to set my background. Okay, so sorry about that. I just need to be sure I'm off distraction here. So POIs in text space. If I don't take you by the 5th minute, you can unmute and ask your POI. I'll definitely take you at will. Just do not badger my speech. Yeah, so I'm starting soon. Just hold on for me, please. Okay, so starting my speech in all right, so starting my speech in starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, let's go. Panel, the idea in this debate is not for us to critique whether or not these individuals can necessarily cause harm independent of the utilization of the social media space in itself. We think that discussion about eco-fascism can necessarily exist outside social media spaces inherently because, like opening government tells you, that these individuals already exist in particular society in themselves. Why is this clarity important? If the entire argument of opening opposition is that we need social media not to restrict these things because we want all manner of balanced discourse in all that, we think we can still achieve that even in a world where we don't sort of allow the proliferation or the infiltration of this sort of ideology within the social media space. What then becomes the burden of the debate? The burden now becomes, at what point do you necessarily censor a particular information? Most importantly, within the assumed actor's position in this debate, being social media platform in themselves. But then secondly, what does this censoring in itself primarily looks like? And what do you sort of stand to like achieve in a world where you do this? And what do you stand to lose in a world where you don't primarily do this? This clarity from closing government is needed because it's going to be engaging all of the misconceptions you had from the opening thing. So let's start, right? First of all, we think censoring information primarily looks like social media platform in themselves tweaking all of their algorithms in terms of reading things that necessarily like attack a particular race, a particular racial group, a particular ideology or phrases that does not primarily conform to the widely accepted social norms within that particular society. And that is why you have Facebook flag down things like offensive words that are being used in today's in today's society, just because algorithms have like been able to like read all of these things. So censoring definitely means at a point where these individuals sort of like try to like establish all of these ideas within their social media spaces in themselves, these things are naturally and like technically and automatically like taken down or flagged down in these sort of instances itself. That's like the clear picture. But then let's look at the role of the media and how they have that direct synergy to the society and what necessarily permits their legitimacy to do this, which is something that is mostly lacking in opening half of the debate. We think and we concede to opening opposition that in as much as these social media platforms themselves are like a direct reflection of the total and widely acceptable norms within that particular society, what it means is that the dispensation of their services in itself ought and would and must always be in tandem with the synergy of their particular service delivery that this society in themselves accept or like necessarily wants. A world where you necessarily work anti to that particular stability and sustainability of what the society in themselves wants in themselves, it means two things. One, you lose buying as social media platform in themselves because you are now serving anti to the services that is required of you. But then secondly, because you also perpetrate a narrative that also like harm this society on the longer run, which means that your own sustainability and the business viability of this social media platform in themselves are very, very like it's being challenged or it's being threatened within these spaces in themselves. But let's look at what this idea of censoring information within these particular instances look like. We think, first of all, that what eco-fascism individuals in this sort of spaces are looking for is not a world where they need a counter-narrative or a counter-argumentation to actually checkmate the, the veracity or the, the tenacity or the improvement of their own particular ideology. Why is this important? Two things. Open opposition tells you that these individuals need to necessarily reflect their ideology, whether or not society buy them, or whether or not these things are good inherently. We think that's a lie. These guys are not necessarily utilizing social media in order for them to have that balance or opposite decisions. What they are necessarily doing is for them to have that widespread proliferation and also exploration of their ideology because of the incentive or the initiative for them to suppress every other individual's view that does not necessarily conform with their own particular ideology. And this is the nature of how these individuals necessarily operate, right? We think, first of all, that these guys operate in a form where they already believe in the supremacy of their ideology, and at a point where you have a counter-narrative that try to like question this thing in themselves, then they take that inherent ideology to be very, very radical in the first place. The impact of this is, if we buy open opposition's word, it means that even when this discourse necessarily exists, right, these guys have less propensity of even like being open to equal or opposite ideology. And at the point where they notice that there are numbers that are already suppressing theirs, right, that's like the best case scenario of open opposition, these guys take the actions to be very, very much more radical within that particular society in order for society to be forced to conform and comply by the ideology that they necessarily stand for. Why is this bad on two different actors? On social media platform, one, it means you have necessarily failed in like sensitizing and censoring information that ought to majorly directly like engage within our society ought to be better preserved in the first place, because this is where it all started from. But then secondly, within that particular society in itself, it means that you have also been able to give that space for individuals to weaponize the massive availability of individuals within that particular society in recruiting numbers of individuals that can be radical and that can also like take that ideology to the extreme worst case scenario in these first instances. We think it is bad on those two different instances in itself. But then let's look at a world where social media necessarily does this and why we think we get better like solvency for this issue in this website. We think at the point where you censor this information and like you make it to be like a norm in your own side of the house, like in our own side of the house, right? Two things could necessarily occur. One, it means that these individuals would need to like necessarily devise a means in like creating a means of like explorating and like proliferating their ideologies within the grassroots different like society through public discourse, like of face-to-face and all that. What that definitely means is that you allow them to have that direct engagement within the real individuals that most of these views are like mostly like what's called challenged with. The impact of that is on how you have that direct CJS system where individuals cannot begin to arrest individuals that mostly feel that their ideology is threatening to their own particular existence. The reason why this is very, very much more important is because it is available within the constitutional provisions for individuals to always incarcerate or report individuals that they feel that are like threatening to their own existence. Why you don't get that in opposition's word is that a world where you allow these things to necessarily occur in the first place, the rich can actually protect themselves. The poor are going to be the one that are going to mostly be affected within these instances, and we don't think that necessarily is like justified. Principal justifications for this: one, opening government tells you that these individuals have to be self-preserved in this first place. we think that beyond the argumentation of self-preservation in this first place, right? We think that social media platform holds corporate social responsibility to this society in how their actions and inactions is something that must always support the sustainability of this society. Understand that the existence of eco-fascism in itself is like a radical view that mostly threatens the safety and the social security of individuals within that particular society, which means that you prioritize the availability of that social media to always frustrate and also entrench and oppress every other person within that your own minority, within that your own particular view. Social media becomes much more responsible in our own side of the house because one, they don't just prevent themselves, but then they fulfill their own corporate social responsibility in contributing their own quota in making sure that the society is better protected, even in a world where you necessarily have to curtail individuals' freedom of speech. And this is justification for it on the last ground. Itself is something that is not mostly absolute.
Thank you very
much. At points where you have the ability to like use these things to harm every other person, it becomes important for actors that have the proxy legitimacy to do this, to necessarily stand on that freedom. And that's why we think it is justified for us to sort of censor this. Proud to propose, yes.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech. Please know that I do not write after 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Please do keep that in mind. And with that being said, we call upon member proposition to open this debate with a closing half of up. Here.
All right. So just to be clear, do I have to keep my video on?
No, you don't have to. It's entirely your decision.
Okay, fine. Okay, so just a moment to organize my notes and then starting a few. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there is an essential problem with OG and CG, and we're going to address this from closing opposition first. OG's entire case is on the idea of, oh, if this thing presents harm, if they say they are going to kill people, we should censor them. They misunderstand the fact that there are already certain metrics that exist in society now to go against things that present harms against persons. So if you tweet that you want to kill somebody, it's going to get flagged. The authorities are going to get informed. Basically, everybody is going to know. If you are tweeting something that is inherently discriminatory, it's going to get flagged. There are metrics that already exist. What this motion tries to do is take out everything entirely that is related to or promoting any way or the other eco-fascism. We're going to show you how this essentially should not even be a thing and why it is a useless waste of time. But what does CG tell us? CG tells us that ultimately this is going to help them bring in, that is going to mean that there's going to be a face-to-face discourse, right? There's a problem with that. CG already concludes that these people have a superiority complex and they need to enforce their ideologies. They also tell us that at the point where those ideologies aren't taken, they tend to get radical, right, and hard points. We think then that it is very stupid to tell us that these people who you have characterized as being very radical and being very prone to being aggressive and all that should then start having public discourses where in person where they are even more likely to harm people. But we'll get into CG later. They are not as relevant as OG. OG tells us, OG concedes, right, that these ideologies have very little buy-in. And then they tell us that, but they also somehow tell us that the ideologies will prevail later and lead to the mass death of people. So social media should prevent this. We think, one, that this is very unfeasible, right? The logic in that is flawed. These people exist in echo chambers, right? And OO brings it up and OG tries to counteract it, right? They said that they already exist in echo chambers. Why do we think this will be worse in a world where we censor them and this is an exclusive extension from CO? We think that ultimately, right, a lot of these ideologies thrive on the particular idea of a presumed self-interest. That is to say, that each and every one of them believes themselves to be true. What do you then have when you censor them? You basically give them the idea that, yeah, we are right, and that is why they are censoring them. You give them the sort of messiah complex that says that the reason why we are being censored is because ultimately these people do not want to accept the truth that we have, or they have recognized the truth and they want to keep us down. This then means that the echo chambers are more promulgated, right? And there are more and more chances of them radicalizing people under this false legitimacy that you have given them because you have censored them. At the point where we censor them, we give them this sort of presumed authority, right? Where we say, oh, these people are so serious that we need to start taking action against them. And ultimately that even walks into their world where we have greater problems of radicalization, right? But exclusive analysis from CO on why exactly this is bad, right? We think that this is bad because ultimately, right, it gives a negative precedent. Why is this so? Panel, we think, as we've already told you, there are certain metrics that already exist. At the point where social media then decides that we are going to scrap off everything related to a particular ideology. The narrative you send not only to those people within the ideology, but to other people outside, is that these social media are acting as sort of quasi-dictators and moral arbiters. Why is this bad? We think that it sets a very negative precedent, because as a member of any other group or any other movement, I am going to have the idea that if my ideas or if my views do not conform to the specific, or what is the specific ideology of Twitter or Facebook, they're going to take me off. This then means that you have less and less information going out in the public space, because people are basically going to start moving away from social media. This means less buying for social media, one, but it also means that there's less political inquest or anything else that has to do with that one, as long as it doesn't buy into the general idea. OG, what's your POI?
All right, so there's a lot of porn on Twitter, but the reason why you have not seen it is that social media are very good at censoring things. But what you're banning is the active political and social use of these things. It's not like you cannot go on Wikipedia and read what Eco-Fascism is. If people want basic information,
okay, thank you, Mark. This even ties into our second point, right? Why we think that at the very minimum, it is even best for climate change. Why is this so? Panel, if I see a piece of news on social media, I am most likely not going to click it. If I see something like, oh, this person is advocating for this, I am probably not going to be interested. Why is this so? Because ultimately, what gathers people's attention is controversy. So when you hear that, oh, this person went to go and block a highway, you're going to want to read, oh, what is this? What happens? We think that eco-fascism comes with a certain level of controversy. This controversy then means that, apart from the fact that OG says that, oh, these people want, OO says that these people want to change the ideology, we think that most importantly, it means that we are able to bring in the ideas of climate change into the public view. So at the very minimum, it means that these things are there and they continue to be there. Why is this best? Because it then means that individuals are able to get more and more information about climate change. This information then translates into better development in society and allows us to be able to fix the essential problems that exist, right? Rather than a world where we simply say that we are censoring these people and then there's less and less information, because the vast majority of people who are into climate change, apart from the eco-fascists, tend to go with a point of view that is not as much bought in or does not generate as much controversy as these eco-fascists. What do you then have in that kind of world? You have a world where we are basically shutting down one group of people. So every other group everywhere else. The question then becomes, how long until it is my turn, right? How long until this social media then decide that my own ideology is not palatable, right? Or is not fit for social media? What you then do with this negative trend is that you ultimately create a world where people are less and less interested in social media. But apart from that, we think that you give social media arbitrary powers by doing this. Why is this so, right? We think that it gives a negative rep. At the point where you're canceling these people in its entirety, people are obviously going to know, right? And we already tell you how they are going to go to these echo chambers. But how the echo chambers are worse are because, one, there is no person to counteract their ideology, right? But apart from that, there are no specific limitations. When somebody is trying to speak on eco-fascism on Twitter or Facebook, he's going to have to tweet it in a certain way to make sure that it doesn't get flagged down for things like hate speech. There is no limitation for them to do that when they are within these echo chambers. It then means that they can go ahead with this ideology in the full force, which ultimately leads to radicalization at grassroots, as OO already tells you. This then means that apart from the fact that we have counteracting growing ideology where there is no interaction, we are still not fixing the problem of climate change, right? We think at the very least, eco-fascism does present some benefits to the world, to our society at large. At the point where we then decide that we are ultimately going to counteract these people or keep them out of the public space, we are not only denying ourselves of the benefits that ultimately we should be getting from that world, but we are taking it away. Another analysis, and this goes as a rebuttal to what CG said, we think that this is an exceptional cost. Why is this so? We think that the current metrics of screening out people who say things that have hate speech are already there. And then when we then want to scrub social media of everything eco-fascism, we are going to have to push in a lot of money. This, as a social media company, if we are assuming they are the actors, we obviously don't want to be spending so much money on something that is pointless and useless and will not even work. Why? Because ultimately we are trying to preserve money and get the best financial autonomy and financial actualization for ourselves. Right? But apart from that, what do you then do when you put in so much money into stopping these people? We think that this means it's not only discriminatory, but it is ultimately going to affect a lot of other people, right? Because the line between eco-fascism and normal climate change activists is very slim in a lot of cases, right? Because there are people who are normal climate change who believe that we should shut down a lot of big companies because of their pollution, right? This is an ideology that also ties into eco-fascism. If you are going to take out all materials, as the motion says specifically, right, all materials that promote eco-fascism, we are ultimately creating a world where we are not only strangling these eco-fascists, but we are strangling political discourse. One, we are taking up from the ability of people, the need of people to buy into social media, but we are also essentially strangling climate change. It then means that social media is seen as a tool by which liberal agendas and identities can be pushed. Why is this even bad? We think that one, it then means that conservatives are less likely likely to buy into social media, one, and they're more likely to push their radicalism. Right? Tell you about how we create a sense of legitimacy to these people, because of course that sense of oppression greatly empowers people. For example, QAnon getting President Trump getting banned off Twitter, and how we basically just exploded into everybody acting out in the way they do. We think that ultimately, right, what we should be looking for is not a word that government preaches when they are saying, oh, we put these people up and tell them to discuss it, where we could endanger people, when we allow their ideology to go in negative grounds too. And ultimately, a world where we present this idea that social media can now be a moral arbiter, which ultimately it is not, right? Especially on the subjectiveness of morality and how there are multiple points of view. We think that social media thrives on its ability to bring. Oh, sorry, my bad.
No worries. We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now we call upon the government whip to close this debate with the government half. Here.
Okay, great. I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, nice. So I'll be happy if in the tech space I can be getting, let's say if I'm in my first minute to indicate second to the 7th minute. Is that okay by you?
Sure.
I want to be able to track really my time efficiency. Yeah. And if you have a POI, just drop in the text space. I'll preferably want to take all the up teams for engagement's sake, and to ensure that you're on the same sheet here. So in 3, 2, 1. So panel, the first thing government is going to do is that write on your script responses from CG to CU. So CEO's fundamental claim in today's debate is that social media platforms should not be moral arbiters. We think that he was unable to explain this burden much better, because he should have gone beyond what he said to show what necessarily social media companies, for example, flag certain particular posts, why they ban certain accounts, etc., and all of those things, right? We don't think this particular point stands, because social media is a virtual form of the physical environment that we live in. It means it's a coagulation of people within the physical environment onto a particular platform that they interact with each other. It means that there's a moral duty embedded on social media to ensure that their environment and platforms are ones that are very safe, responsible, and able to help the mental health of people. But secondly, protect them, because it is when social media companies are able to fundamentally do all of these things that people are much more willing to stay within their platforms. This means 2 important reasons. It means that, number one, their world is one that increasingly makes social media chaotic and one that is unhealthy for people, which means that for people who can't be able to cope up with the chaos that their world fails to say that social media must take up that responsibility, are going to fall out of those platforms, right? But number 2, it means in their world, it's always the bad ideologies or the radical ideologies that inherently indignifies human rights and human lives, etc., are the ones going to travel, that are going to travel. Now, their case is so problematic because the point of the success of social media companies is how they're able to protect everyone. That includes their capacity to be able to incapacitate any particular group of people, no matter how healthy their ideologies are. If they inherently attack fundamental beliefs of people, they should be incapacitated. This is well enough in tandem with the CJS system. Governments know that people can express themselves anyhow they want. But if I want to express myself by using a gun to shoot someone, government says, no, I can't exist within a society. I must be taken out. That is how social media is. Social media is a second environment, a virtual environment of the physical environment. It means there's an onus and a huge amount of moral duty on these guys to do so. CEO fundamentally loses this debate on the root of their best case scenario, right? The second most important thing that CEO brings to you is the idea of how social media is going to increasingly lose irrelevance. We don't think that is true, because most of the people who preach violent, radical ideas are people who already have a support base. Whether they are on the platform or not, they will still succeed. That is why Trump created a truth social media platform, and it's still able to get millions of people. Those people are not people who were opposing him. They are his core grounded fan base, etc. Whether they are on the platforms or not, they can have them. But the most distinct, important thing that happens in our world that we incapacitate him and all his ideologies, and they are unable to go ahead to make the other masses really suffer, who are in the majority. That is what democracy actually really speaks about. We think CEO is down for three important reasons. Number one, they are unable to show how, for example, social media should protect people who participate in them. Number two, they are unable to show how we incapacitate people who are toxic and can be able to pander upon vulnerable people, right? Now, write this on your script, responses to OO, right? OO's biggest claim in today's debate is that ideologies must be allowed to interact, and that interactions allows them to be questioned, right? Member of government is able to explain to you how this is very problematic for two important reasons. Because it tells you that these radical ideologies are not like normal ideologies that like are hard to buy into, right? Which OG talks to you about, but they don't explain how that actually really means, right? Now, people can actually relate so well with problems of overpopulation, because overpopulation brings forth so much competition to use social amenities, competition for jobs, poverty, and huge dependency ratios and growing older populations, right? People are not always frustrated with the problems that comes with overpopulation. This means that people are already on the edge and they are angry at the government of the day. And that means that what happens in OO and CO's world, which OO actually really shows very well, is that they redirect this anger from citizens to citizens. And this is very, very bad and not sustainable, for example, for fighting for the life of the earth, because the people who do the biggest harm are not the citizens. Even if you say citizens use charcoal, coal, whatever, they are way minority components, even if you coagulate them, right? We think that a single factory that exploits oil on the sea pollutes the climate than even 3 billion people on this earth who use charcoal in their homes or even cut down a tree. This means that the biggest perpetrators of the things that threaten the life of society are the big industrial guys. The billionaires who want to set up factories but don't want to produce bio-friendly things that won't harm the earth. It means that the people who harm are the governments, the politicians who always want to take cutbacks to ensure that some big company somewhere is able to settle and flout like rules that promote climate change, etc. What does this mean? It means that on the comparative, their world is not sustainable in achieving the goal of the eco-fascist movement, because it means that you just turn citizens against each other. But most likely, MG has told you that when this happens, which I've used this to explain how like that buying happens, they can and they are angry because they can't get jobs, etc. And they want to see how they can spill off that anger. OG doesn't usually really mechanize it to you. CG does that. We think that you own that, right? I'll shoot your POI.
Okay, so the question you have to answer is, when people can interrogate these ideas by themselves, that's counterfactual. Why should social media companies have this ability, especially when they can determine what harms, what or whose harm should be directed?
POI close. So, panel, the reason why this is important for you to note sustainability, because in their world, even if citizens are going to turn against citizens, we think they are just going to turn against like people because they are jobless, because they're not getting the sort of things they should be getting. It is from the government. It is, and they end up fighting each other, right? Killing each other. When you think that there is the vulnerable individuals who are going to be actually really at the mercy of this eco-fascism, because we think wealthy individuals like Elon Musk, those big guys who own companies that pollute more, are more likely to protect themselves because they have security, etc. At the end of the day, you take away the burden that people have to push onto government to solve the existential threats against the life of the earth, which MG explains to you from his point about how those ideologies are non-conformist and those ideologies are never tolerant in their nature. It means that on the comparative in their world, we never get any solution for climate change and how to solve the threat that happens in the world. But in our world, we ensure that people redirect this particular blame, because you can't do social media. You are forced to go onto the street, protest, and get governments to pay attention to those things. We think that is more efficient because that's where the laws exist. They're the ones who give people who take kickbacks, and all of those things actually really happen, right? In most, like worst case scenario in their world is that, oh, they will exist, but secondly, they will never tolerate energy. They're like Boko Haram, they're like extremist groups. They never tolerate any other compelling ideologies, which MG has told you, and he says they will never change, right? And I've showed you with true social media, right? We think then private, vulnerable individuals are the ones who are going to be at the mercy of today's case, right? We think that you mustn't prioritize a world where all ideologies exist just because we want to exist. Number two, you must prioritize moral arbitration. But lastly, we're better than OG because we mechanize that they should this debate. We think that we win today's debate. Thank you very much.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now we call upon the opposition whip to close this debate for the whole House. Hear, hear.
All right, am I audible, please?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so I'm Odeolaj, and my POIs, I prefer them to be in the text space. If I would take you, I would ask you to unmute. So Chair, please time in, let me just know when I'm on 1 minute and then 6. Yeah. On that note, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, so at the end of today's debate, what today's debate should be judged upon largely is on the question of what world best sustains the social media by and large, because we must understand that the main actor of today's debate, or rather stakeholder, is the social media in and of itself, which then has a trickle or ripple effect down to the society sideline, right? To an extent where we show you that our world is one that best sustains the social media, ensuring buy-ins and people conceding to it and using it more and more, then we win from side C. Oh, but then basic things you need to get into this debate, right? How that my partner clearly showed you the proximity between racism, like fascism, right, eco-fascism, and climate change activists, right? How that is one ideology that ties them together largely. And this ideology is ideology on climate change, that they want a better eco-friendly system, right? My partner clearly shows you that there is a thin line between these two. What it means is that if you cancel eco-fascism, if you cancel eco-fascist, it means that climate change activists necessarily would not find a way to thrive. Why? Because there's an algorithm that's going to be prepared and will not allow for these like climate change activists to thrive on social media spaces. What it means is that when they post things or they do things, it has been taken down, right? And so people don't necessarily see any information on climate change and don't necessarily see the arms in such instances. Why is this important, right? My partner clearly shows you how that there are selfish interests in every ideology, right? So we concede to what has run into this debate that eco-fascists have their flaws, they are radical and all of those funny things, right? But we need to understand how that there is a selfish interest in every ideology. What is the interest of eco-fascists, right? What they want is a climate stable community. This is similar to climate change activists, right? Long time ago, feminism was something that was not largely bought in the society. Other people thought it was against patriarchal fuckery, right? And it was against the presidency of men over the woman race largely. So initially, it was not accepted, right? But social media gave a room for it. Feminists began to see spaces in social media places, right? These spaces allowed for discussions and all of these things and ensures that people saw sense in feminism and largely people began to buy it. What my partner clearly shows you is that totally censoring this thing out of the box and shutting them out of social media is one that is wrong. One, because social media in and of itself is immoral and not moral enough, right? So CJ comes to ask questions as rebuttals and all of this, and I engage them directly in your panel. Now, today's world, it is immoral for certain people in the world, or even a large consensus, a large number of people, adults, right, to see certain exclusive naked and nude videos on certain sites and social media spaces, right? Certain ideologies, beliefs, and religions don't buy into that. But social media still pops this at our faces on daily basis, right? We say social media is moral. Doesn't mean they don't know that these stuffs are bad or people don't largely like them, but it means that they feel that there is a certain number of people who buy into these pornographic and nude pictures and we still have to post them by and large, because what they want basically is that social media thrives on buy-ins, right? They are capitalists with their ideologies. What they thrive in is buy-ins, people concede to them, people come online on Facebook and then they get their cash, right? So whether something is moral or immoral, right, social media only takes a stand to ensure that they try to mitigate it. And this is the metric that my partner clearly shows you that already exists in status quo. If these metrics exist in status quo, we see no reason why we should totally cancel out this ideology of eco-fascism, especially when we show you the kind of good that still exists in the ideology by and large. Note that every ideology have their selfish interest. We consider eco-fascism can be radical, but it still has its good by and large. We want a discussion around climate change, and we feel our world best achieves that, right? So, right, like basically, so OG tells us, right? OG believes that eco-fascism exists, but doesn't have a pool of buy-in since it goes against human dignity and all of those stuff, right? And feels it is legitimate that social media only permits what is general consensus. To an extent where we show you, right, that Every ideology has its own selfish interest, and there needs to be a room for freedom of speech. We already showed you how that social media is immoral and not necessarily a moral arbitrary, right? We also show you, right, like, this is like an even if analysis. Even if at all social media is presumed to be moral, right? Even if, panel, morality does not extend to total cancellation. And this is tied out to the analysis I just gave you, right? So social media probably knows that it is immoral for kids to watch nude pics or something online. So they create a kind of restriction, say age restriction, and certain options to come for you to decide if you want to opt in on all of those things. Even when you opt in that you don't want, once in a while, they still pop it at you, and then you still have to decide to go. And the more you go, the more you subscribe, the more you get all of those instances. So there are metrics that already exist for such checks, right? So even if we consider social media is moral, we say morality should not extend to a level of total cancellation, which is very problematic, right? And what does my partner tells you at this, right? When we totally cancel these guys out of the space, right? What do you get from my partner, which is very, very important and a winning case in our world, right? What it then means is that you give these guys a presumed authority, because it then pushes the narrative that they are good and then they don't want them to thrive in the society. My partner clearly shows you how that controversy around these stuff grabs people's attention, like intention and all of those things. So when people begin to look into it, and then it even promotes the buy-ins for these people, because like the problems that came around feminism and how the shout was so much on social media was what brought about so much buy-ins for feminism, even in status quo like we have now, right? So CG, what's your POI? Quickly. You can unmute, CG.
Pano, understand that they are going to exist in the physical environment. That wouldn't be social media. Let them be there. It shouldn't be a social media where people are vulnerable and they can take advantage of them, put them in echo chambers.
All right,
and
thank you. Hello, thank you. You had your 7 minutes. All right. So I think this is a very funny case for CG to run, right? How that humans are more vulnerable on social media compared to physical appearances. And this is one thing. This is one thing that my partner clearly shows you on the risk of physical media, like when you meet people in person with your radical ideology. So to an extent where CG clearly agrees that the ideologies of eco-fascists is highly radical, why then should you push for a face-to-face like engagement when you already know that this ideology is not one that thrives in society? It then means that their radicality is a threat to people's life. Understand, panel, that in the info slide, eco-fascists do not mind killing people just to ensure their ideology thrives, right? And all of those instances. So when they push in their work from side CG, I feel they should fall flat and probably come to this debate, right? Because they are pushing for a physical media compared to social media where discourse could probably happen and where all of these things exist, right? And on the clash on legitimacy of the social media by and large, right, we clearly showed you, right, that it is illegitimate, right, and immoral, unrighteous, and like not morally considered that social media should become a monopoly of power or a decider of what information should necessarily go around, right? And this is one thing you get from my partner, right? When it clearly shows you about the narrative ideology, right, that this creates a negative precedent. So this then pushes the narrative that social media are seen as costly dictators and moral arbitrators, right? What does this lead to? It leads to less buying for the social media spaces, because people then begin to feel that my idea cannot thrive on social media. Panel, understand that when this thing is called out and when it is cancelled, it means that people who post certain things, once it has the narrative that is tied to eco-fascism or even climate change and of itself, because of the system of algorithm that works, these guys are going to be pulled down, right? What it then means is that when excessively people's posts and tweets is being taken down over time, people lose buy-ins and interest in social media spaces. Second analysis you get from my partner is on the cost that it takes to build this ideal narrative, right? We already showed you that social media owners are largely capitalists and they also have their own ideology. So we should not give them that moral right to like see ideologies that thrive in the society largely, right? And then also less political interest from the political gurus who are interested in social media anyway. But then at the end of today's debate, who best wins, right, is what best ensures social media stability and state by and large. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech, and we thank everyone for a very, very interesting debate. And that brings us to the end of this debate round. I'd like you all to just please clear the room.